Even within one of the most brutal regimes in history, there were lines. Lines that most units never crossed. But one brigade did. Formed in the chaos of war, driven by violence rather than discipline, this unit became so feared that even members of the Schutzstaffel, a force already known for its cruelty, began to see them as uncontrollable. They were not just soldiers. They were something far more dangerous. This is the story of the brigade led by Bronislav Kaminski, and how their actions during World War II shocked even those who created them. The origins of this brigade trace back to the chaos on the Eastern Front. As Nazi Germany pushed deeper into Soviet territory, they faced a growing problem. Controlling vast occupied regions filled with resistance movements, partisans, and civilians who refused to submit. To maintain control, German forces began forming auxiliary units, local militias made up of collaborators who would fight against Soviet resistance. These groups were often given power, weapons, and autonomy, but very little oversight. One such unit would become known as the Russian Liberation People's Army, or RONA. At its center was a man named Bronislav Kaminski. Kaminski was not a traditional military leader. He rose to power in a region known as the Lokot Autonomy, an area where German forces allowed local collaborators to govern with relative independence. In this environment, Kaminski built his own force, loyal not to discipline or order, but to him personally. At first, this arrangement seemed useful. RONA units were tasked with anti-partisan operations, hunting resistance fighters, securing territory, and enforcing control over local populations. But as time went on, reports began to emerge. Not of organized military action, but of chaos. The brigade developed a reputation for extreme brutality, lack of discipline, and unchecked behavior. Instead of acting as a structured force, they operated more like an armed group driven by opportunity, taking what they wanted when they wanted without regard for command structures. This created a problem. Even within a system already defined by violence, there were expectations of control. Orders were meant to be followed. Actions were meant to serve strategic goals. But Kaminski's brigade often ignored those boundaries. And as their power grew, so did the concern. Because what had once been a useful tool was becoming something unpredictable, something dangerous. Even to those who created WWII 1944, the war had begun to turn. German forces were no longer advancing, they were retreating. Pressure from the Soviet advance in the east was relentless, and resistance movements across occupied Europe were growing stronger. It was in this desperate moment that Warsaw Uprising erupted. The Polish resistance, determined to reclaim their capital before Soviet forces arrived, launched a massive revolt against German occupation. For the leadership of Nazi Germany, crushing this uprising became an absolute priority. And for that task, they turned to units willing to do what others would not. Among them was the brigade led by Bronislav Kaminski. Kaminski's forces were deployed into Warsaw with one clear objective: eliminate resistance and restore control, by any means necessary. But what followed went far beyond even the brutal expectations of occupation warfare. From the moment they entered the city, reports began to surface, not of organized combat, but of chaos. Entire districts fell into disorder as the brigade operated with little coordination, focusing less on military targets and more on unchecked violence and looting. Command structures broke down. Orders were ignored. Instead of functioning as a disciplined force, the brigade acted independently, often pursuing its own interests rather than the strategic goals set by German leadership. Even within the already ruthless framework of the Schutzstaffel, this behavior raised serious concerns. Because this was no longer just brutality, it was instability. For Nazi command, the suppression of the uprising required precision, controlled force directed at eliminating resistance. But Kaminski's brigade created the opposite effect: disorder that threatened to undermine the entire operation. Civilian areas became zones of uncontrolled violence, further inflaming resistance rather than crushing it. What was meant to be a demonstration of power began to look like something else entirely, something reckless. And that was dangerous, not because of morality but because of control. As the situation in Warsaw intensified, complaints and reports reached higher command. Officers within the SS and German military began to question whether Kaminski's unit was still an asset or had become a liability. The very qualities that once made the brigade useful, its willingness to act without restraint, were now becoming its greatest weakness. Because in a system built on absolute authority, there was one thing that could not be tolerated. A force that could not be controlled. As the chaos in Warsaw intensified, the situation surrounding Bronislav Kaminski and his brigade began to shift rapidly. What had once been tolerated was now being questioned. Reports continued to reach higher command within the Schutzstaffel, not just about brutality, but about disorder, indiscipline, and a complete disregard for authority. The issue was no longer what the brigade was doing, it was the fact that they could not be controlled. In a system built on strict hierarchy, this was unacceptable. Senior SS leaders began to see Kaminski not as an asset, but as a liability. His unit's actions were disrupting operations during the Warsaw Uprising, creating confusion rather than reinforcing control. The very mission they were sent to accomplish was being undermined. And in Nazi command structures, failure, especially unpredictable failure, had consequences. Behind closed doors, decisions were being made. Kaminski was summoned under the pretense of a meeting. There was no public announcement, no formal trial in the traditional sense. Instead, what followed reflected the internal methods of control used by the regime itself. He was arrested by German authorities. Shortly afterward, Bronislav Kaminski was executed. The official explanation given to his troops was carefully constructed, a claim that he had been killed by enemy forces. But the truth was far more controlled. He had been removed by the very system he served. A message had been sent. No matter how brutal a unit was, no matter how useful it had once been, stepping outside the chain of command would not be tolerated. Following his death, the brigade itself began to disintegrate. Without Kaminski's leadership, cohesion collapsed. Elements of the unit were absorbed into other formations, while others were quietly dissolved. The experiment was over. What remained was a clear lesson for Nazi leadership. Creating forces without discipline carried risks, even for a regime built on violence. Because unchecked power, once unleashed, does not always stay under control. And in the case of Kaminski's brigade, it became something even their own commanders feared. After the removal of Bronislav Kaminski, the immediate chaos surrounding his brigade began to settle, but the consequences of their actions did not disappear. In the aftermath of the Warsaw Uprising, German command worked quickly to restore order within its ranks. Units that had operated with too much independence were either restructured or quietly dissolved. The priority was no longer just suppressing resistance, it was re-establishing control over their own forces. Fragments of Kaminski's brigade were absorbed into other formations under tighter supervision. What had once been an autonomous and feared unit was now broken apart, its identity fading into the larger machinery of Nazi Germany. But the damage had already been done. Within military and SS circles, the episode became a cautionary example. Even inside the Schutzstaffel, where harsh measures were standard, there was an expectation of discipline and coordination. Kaminski's brigade had violated that expectation, not by being brutal, but by being unpredictable. And unpredictability threatened authority. The events in Warsaw also had a broader impact. Instead of weakening resistance through fear alone, the uncontrolled violence often intensified hostility among the local population. It reinforced the determination of those fighting back, making the conflict even more volatile. For Nazi leadership, this created a contradiction. They relied on fear to maintain power, but too much chaos weakened their ability to control it. In the years after the war, historians would revisit these events, not just to document what happened, but to understand how such a unit was allowed to exist in the first place. The story of Kaminski's brigade became a study in what happens when authority delegates power without limits. It showed that even in one of history's most rigid systems, cracks could form. And when they did, the consequences were severe, not only for those who suffered under that power, but for those who tried to wield it. By the end, the brigade was no longer remembered as a strategic force or a military unit. It was remembered as a warning, a reminder that when control is lost, even within systems built on absolute authority, The results can spiral beyond intention. In the final stages of World War II, as the power of Nazi Germany began to collapse, many of the structures it had built started to fall apart with it. But some stories stood out more than others. The brigade led by Bronislav Kaminski was one of them. Not because it was the most powerful, not because it changed the course of the war, but because it revealed something deeper, something even the regime itself struggled to control. This was a unit created to enforce authority through fear, yet it became a force that operated beyond authority itself. It showed that when power is handed over without limits, it does not simply follow orders, it evolves, often in ways that cannot be contained. Even within the ranks of the Schutzstaffel, an organization already defined by its harsh methods, there were expectations of discipline, coordination, and obedience. Kaminski's brigade broke those expectations, and in doing so, it crossed an invisible line. The decision to remove Kaminski was not about justice, it was about restoring control. It was a reminder that in systems built on absolute authority, loyalty is only valued as long as it remains predictable. Once that predictability is gone, so is protection. Today, historians look back at this chapter as more than just a footnote of war. It is a case study in the dangers of unchecked power, of what happens when systems prioritize control over accountability, and when violence becomes a tool without restraint. The story does not end with the brigade's disappearance. It continues as a warning, because history has shown, time and again, that when authority creates forces it cannot control, those forces do not simply disappear. They leave behind consequences, and sometimes those consequences echo far longer than the war itself.